YSL. How a designer revolutionized female empowerment with a tuxedo. Few people realize it, but some revolutions don't begin with shouts, protests, or slogans. They begin in the mirror. They begin the moment someone looks at themselves and no longer sees themselves as small, limited, or asking for permission. Most believe that female empowerment was born from political speeches or explicit battles, but the truth, uncomfortable for some, is that a decisive part of this change began with an outfit, a tuxedo, something seemingly simple, but laden with meaning. For decades, women were told that strength and elegance couldn't coexist. You were either delicate or you were taken seriously. The paradox is that it only took one quiet, sensitive, and unconventional designer to dismantle that belief without raising his voice. He didn't try to convince anyone with arguments, he preferred to show. And when you show something clearly, the world is forced to react. The women's tuxedo wasn't created to please, it was created to reposition. And that changes everything. Perhaps you've never stopped to think that the way you dress influences how you think, act, and even how you are treated. But what if I told you that dressing with power is the first step to living it? That certain external choices reprogram your internal posture? This story isn't just about fashion, nor about luxurious catwalks. It's about identity, presence, and freedom. And by understanding how it all began, you start to see your own reflection in a way that will hardly ever be the same again. Paris in the 1960s, and the birth of a silent rebellion. Paris, early 1960s. On the outside, lights, charming cafes, and an aura of artistic freedom. Inside, invisible rules dictated exactly how a woman should dress, behave, and even occupy spaces. Women's fashion was beautiful, yes, but it also functioned as a gilded cage, full skirts, cinched waists, obligatory delicacy. Anyone who deviated from this was seen as out of place. And let's face it, place was something women were still learning to conquer. In this scenario, silence often spoke louder than any fiery speech. While social movements were beginning to bubble up, the feminist revolution was still moving slowly, almost stealthily. Women could work, but not appear too powerful. They could express their opinions, but without confronting. They could dream, as long as they fit within the imposed limits. Clothing, curiously, was one of those limits. A simple piece of fabric carried profound social codes, as if saying, "You cannot pass this far." And it's curious to realize how, often, oppression doesn't shout. It whispers, disguises itself as tradition, as good taste, as "it's always been this way." It is precisely in this fertile ground, full of contained tension, that an elegant rebellion emerges, almost imperceptible at first glance. It wasn't a protest in the streets, nor slogans on posters. It was something more subtle, more strategic, more dangerous, changing the way women saw themselves in the mirror. Because when the image changes, the posture changes along with it, and the world reacts. And it is at this point that a young creator enters, seemingly fragile, but with a vision capable of turning this game around without raising his voice. And this leads us directly to the next chapter of this story. Who was Yves Saint Laurent before he challenged the world? Before becoming synonymous with revolution, Yves Saint Laurent was simply a young man too sensitive for a world too harsh. Born far from Parisian glamour, he grew up introspective, shy, almost out of place, using drawing as a refuge. While other boys sought strength in muscles, he found power in lines, cuts, and ideas. From an early age, he seemed to understand something few perceived. Clothing doesn't just cover the body. It reveals intentions. And perhaps that's why he observed so much in silence, before daring to speak through fashion. When he arrived in Paris and joined the Dior fashion house, everything happened too fast. Early success, enormous responsibility, constant pressure. Yves rose to the top while still young, but the price came with it. Criticism, demands, deep emotional crises. He didn't have the classic profile of the confident genius. On the contrary, he was fragile, anxious, human. And it is precisely this fragility that makes him dangerous in the best sense of the word. Because those who feel too much see beyond. Those who suffer understand what it is to be trapped in expectations they didn't choose. When he was dismissed from Dior, many believed that was the end of his story. But curiously, it was at that point that something changed. Free from constraints, Yves began to create not to please, but to express himself. And when a creator stops asking for permission, he begins to change entire structures. The experience of exclusion, of inadequacy, made him recognize the same feeling in women. And perhaps it was, there, in that silent mirroring, that the desire was born to offer them something he himself sought: freedom with elegance. And this begins to take shape in the next idea he dared to put into the world: the emergence of the women's tuxedo, the seed of a revolution. The idea of the women's tuxedo didn't come from nowhere, nor from an isolated aesthetic desire. It arose from a silent, almost psychological observation. Why did those in power always wear men's suits? Yves Saint Laurent perceived something simple yet profound. When a man enters a room in a suit, he is automatically taken seriously. Posture changes. Respect comes before words. So the question wasn't about fashion, it was about access. What if a woman could embody that same authority without sacrificing her femininity? In his mind, it wasn't about copying the men's wardrobe, but about reinterpreting it. The women's tuxedo emerged as an elegant translation of power: straight lines, structured shoulders, a defined waist, nothing aggressive, everything precise. It was almost like saying, she doesn't need to masculinize herself to be strong. A practical example of this is noticing how well-tailored clothes even change the way you walk. Try a well-fitted blazer, and notice how your body responds. Clothing teaches the body to occupy space. Yves understood that symbols precede behaviors. First the image changes, then the attitude, and only then does society follow. The tuxedo was a seed planted in still resistant ground, but he knew. It only took one woman to look in the mirror and recognize her power for something irreversible to begin. And like any idea that shakes deep structures, this one wouldn't be received with immediate applause. On the contrary, the world would react, and react strongly, when this garment was finally presented. Le smoking is presented to the world, and the scandal begins. When the women's tuxedo finally appeared on the catwalks, the shock was immediate. It wasn't just a new garment. It was a breaking of the social code. Women were now wearing something that, until then, had symbolized male authority, institutional power, and an unquestionable presence. For many, it sounded like an affront: elegant, silent, but profoundly provocative. The criticism came not only from fashion but from society as a whole, which was still trying to decide how far women could go without crossing the line. And the most curious thing is that the clash wasn't limited to magazines or haute couture salons. Women began to be barred from restaurants, clubs, and events simply for wearing a tuxedo. Imagine the scene: entering a sophisticated space, well-dressed, confident, and being asked to leave for appearing inappropriate. This type of resistance reveals much more about the fear of change than about the clothing itself. When a garment is so bothersome, it's because it has touched on something too sensitive. Still, some women decided to pay the price. They wore the tuxedo not only as an aesthetic choice, but as a statement. It was almost a test of daily courage, leaving home knowing that stares would come, comments would arise, doors might close. But curiously, something also opened up inside. Because when someone stands by who they are, even under disapproval, That firmness begins to infect the environment. And little by little, what was scandalous begins to become a symbol. And that's when the tuxedo ceases to be just clothing and begins to function as armor. Why did the women's tuxedo become a symbol of power and freedom? The women's tuxedo didn't become a symbol of power by chance. It touches on something deeply psychological. When a woman wears a tuxedo, she's not just wearing elegant clothes, she's asserting her presence. The straight tailoring, the defined shoulders, the contrast of black and white create a silent message. I know who I am. And the human brain responds quickly to visual symbols. Even before speech, respect has already been triggered. It's like entering a meeting with the right posture before opening your mouth. There's also a little discussed detail. The tuxedo doesn't sexualize, it neutralizes. Instead of drawing attention to curves, it draws attention to the whole person. This changes the game. The woman ceases to be observed only as an image and begins to be perceived as a presence. A practical example of this appears even today in the corporate environment. Well-structured pieces help a woman to be heard with more seriousness. It's not about hiding femininity, but about choosing when and how it enters the scene. Over time, the tuxedo becomes almost an internal code of self-confidence. Those who wear it feel it. Those who observe notice it. And when many women begin to feel this strength at the same time, the symbol spreads. It's no different from learning something new that changes your way of thinking. Once the key turns, you can't unsee it. The garment opened a door, but what passed through it was a new mentality. And from then on, other women began to use this piece not only to dress themselves, but to take a stand. And some would do so in such a striking way that they would help to immortalize this legacy. Iconic women who transformed the tuxedo into armor. When iconic women began wearing the tuxedo, something changed. It was no longer just a runway creation, but a living statement in motion. Bianca Jagger. For example, he entered high-level events wearing his tuxedo with disconcerting ease, as if to say, I belong here. There was no effort, no need for approval. The impact came precisely from that confident calm, and that, let's face it, disarms any resistance. Already Catherine Deneuve, she took the tuxedo to another territory, that of intellectual elegance. By wearing it, she showed that sensuality lies not in revealing, but in mastering one's own image. Many women saw a practical possibility there, using clothing as an ally in environments where being taken seriously was still a challenge. It's like consciously choosing the tone of one's own voice in an important conversation. Clothing also communicates intention. These women weren't just well-dressed, they were protected. The tuxedo functioned as a symbolic armor against others' expectations. And the most interesting thing is that none of them became a different person by wearing it. They only amplified who they already were. When public figures do this, they open the door for thousands of other women to do the same in their daily lives. And from that point on, the tuxedo ceases to be a glamorous exception and becomes a cultural reference. And every reference, sooner or later, provokes an even greater structural change. The domino effect, how the tuxedo paved the way for modern fashion. After the women's tuxedo establishes itself as a symbol, the impact isn't limited to it. What happens is a true domino effect. Fashion begins to question boundaries that previously seemed non-negotiable. Masculine and feminine cease to be closed boxes and become points of dialogue. Women's tailoring gains strength, comfort becomes an aesthetic argument, and the idea of the right clothes for the right gender begins to sound outdated. When one symbol falls, others go with it. This movement wasn't just creative, it was strategic. From then on, women began choosing clothes with function, presence, and intention in mind, not just appearance. A practical example of this is observing how the structured blazer has become almost universal. From the office to an elegant dinner, it communicates firmness effortlessly. Clothing begins to serve real life, not the other way around. It's like organizing the house to facilitate daily life, not just for visitors to see. The most interesting thing is that this change didn't require long speeches or explicit manifestos. It happened in the body, in the mirror, in the daily experience of dressing. When fashion allows freedom, behavior follows. And this new way of thinking about dressing opened up space for something even greater: the understanding that some pieces are not trends, they are language. And when a language is established, it leaves a legacy. And it is precisely there that the story of Yves Saint Laurent reaches a level that goes far beyond the wardrobe. The legacy of Yves Saint Laurent. When a garment becomes a manifesto. Yves Saint Laurent's true legacy lies not only in the clothes he created, but in the permission he granted. Permission for women to occupy space, to not apologize for appearing strong, to choose how they want to be seen. The women's tuxedo became a silent manifesto precisely for this reason. It doesn't shout, it doesn't confront directly, it simply asserts itself with elegance. And ultimately, the most lasting changes always begin like this, almost without fanfare. Over time, the tuxedo ceased to be just a fashion icon and began to function as a cultural language. It taught us that dressing is also an act of strategic communication. A simple example of this is in everyday life. How many times does the right outfit change how someone is treated in a meeting, a negotiation, or even an important encounter? Yves understood early on that image is not vanity. It's positioning. And positioning, when well constructed, changes entire trajectories. More than liberating fashion, it helped liberate narratives. Women didn't need to choose between strength and elegance. They could have both. This thinking spread beyond clothing and influenced behaviors, choices, and ambitions. When a garment manages to provoke this kind of internal transformation, it ceases to be a trend and becomes an heirloom. And every heirloom carries a silent question. What do you do with the power you now hold in your hands? Power begins when you choose to take a stand. Throughout this story, it becomes clear that true power has never been just about the tuxedo, but about the decision to occupy space without asking permission. Knowledge, when profound, ceases to be theory and becomes practice. And now the question is direct. What are you going to do with all of this? In which areas of your life are you still dressing cautiously when you could be dressing with presence? Small daily choices shape big changes, and many of them begin even before the first word is spoken. Reflect. How do you enter the environments you frequent? What message do your posture, your image, and your attitudes communicate before you even speak? It's not about copying styles or following trends, but about understanding the impact of conscious choices. Try observing how you feel when you take a firmer stance, when you stand by who you are without excessive explanations. The world reacts differently when you change the way you present yourself to it. Now, I challenge you. What's stopping you from taking that next step? Fear of judgment, discomfort, or change? Every real transformation begins when someone decides to break out of autopilot. If this content made you think, act, or see something new, don't let it stop here. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and continue learning how style, mindset, and positioning can change the way you live, work, and see yourself.